The Threshold Guardian. What your nervous system cannot yet comprehend, you have been living in a prison so complete, so architecturally perfect, that you mistook its walls for the boundaries of reality itself. Every bill you couldn't pay was not merely a financial transaction denied. It was a psychic wound, a daily reminder that the universe operates by rules that exclude you. Every night you fell asleep, calculating survival was not just exhaustion. It was your ego reinforcing the bars of a cage it built to protect you from a far more terrifying truth, that you are not separate from abundance. You never were. Carl Jung understood what modern psychology still refuses to fully acknowledge, that the psyche does not distinguish between literal and symbolic. When money appears in your life suddenly, carried by the hand of a stranger or the algorithm of a system you never trusted, your conscious mind attempts to categorize it as luck, coincidence, or the whims of an indifferent universe. But your unconscious knows better. It recognizes this moment as the culmination of every prayer you never voiced, every silent scream for relief, every moment you chose presence over panic when your entire external world was collapsing. This is why I mapped out the 3 keys to a prosperous life. A practical trilogy of understanding, ebook and audiobook, specifically designed for those who find themselves at this precise psychological threshold. It's not about manifestation tricks or financial strategies. It's about the deep archetypal work required to hold abundance without self-destructing, to receive without the crushing guilt that makes chosen ones return their blessings like unwanted gifts. You'll find the link in the pinned comment below, but know this: what I've placed there is not separate from what we're exploring now. It is the map for the territory we're about to traverse together. The stranger's transfer, whether literal currency arriving unexpectedly or the symbolic representation of grace entering your existence, is what Jung termed an eruption from the collective unconscious. Your personal unconscious has been screaming for relief, yes, but the collective unconscious, that vast ocean of archetypal energy that connects every human psyche, has been watching your resistance, your endurance, your refusal to abandon your own becoming, even when abandonment would have been so much easier. The mechanics of psychological compensation, why suffering precedes. Abundance, Jung's principle of compensation, reveals a mathematical precision to the psyche that most people find disturbing. The unconscious mind operates as a balancing mechanism, constantly attempting to correct the one-sidedness of conscious attitudes. When your conscious existence has been dominated by scarcity, not just financial scarcity, but emotional scarcity, spiritual scarcity, the scarcity of being truly seen, the unconscious begins generating compensatory symbols with increasing intensity. At first, these symbols appear in dreams. You might dream of finding money in unexpected places, of rooms in your house you never knew existed, of treasures buried in your own backyard. The psyche is preparing you, creating neural pathways for the possibility of abundance before the external world has caught up. But if the conscious mind remains rigidly attached to its scarcity narrative, if the ego continues to say, "I am the one who struggles, therefore I am," the unconscious must escalate. This escalation manifests as synchronicities. The same number appears repeatedly. A stranger mentions the exact solution to a problem you've been privately wrestling with. Opportunities emerge from impossible quarters. These are not random events. They are the self, that totality of your conscious and unconscious being, attempting to communicate through the only language available when words have failed. The self speaks through symbols, through pattern, through what appears to be coincidence, but is actually the architecture of your own becoming made visible. The chosen ones experience this compensation more intensely because they have strayed further from their own center. Not through weakness, but through a kind of strength that the world mistakes for suffering. You have been carrying collective shadow material, the doubt, the fear, the unworthiness of an entire lineage, because some part of you was strong enough to hold it. Every ancestor who died believing they didn't deserve, every parent who taught you that wanting was dangerous, every cultural message that wealth corrupts and poverty sanctifies, you absorbed all of it. This absorption was not passive, it was a kind of unconscious agreement. I will carry this burden so others don't have to. I will be the one who questions, who doubts, who struggles visibly so that the pattern can finally be seen and broken. Jung would recognize this as the wounded healer archetype manifesting. You must experience the wound fully, completely, without rescue, so that when healing comes, it comes with the authority of lived truth. But here is where the psychology becomes dangerous, and most people fail the test. The moment abundance arrives, every single survival mechanism that kept you alive during scarcity becomes your greatest enemy. The hypervigilance that helped you navigate lack becomes paranoia in the face of plenty. The humility that protected you from arrogance becomes self-sabotage disguised as virtue. The silence that was once protective isolation becomes a golden prison where transformation suffocates under the weight of unexpressed gratitude. The shadow's violent resistance. Why you want to destroy your own blessing. Jung spent decades mapping the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we cannot or will not acknowledge. The disowned parts of our psyche that we project onto others or bury so deep we forget they exist. For chosen ones, the shadow contains not just darkness, but light. You have repressed not only your rage, your selfishness, your hunger for recognition, but also your brilliance, your worthiness, your capacity to receive without earning through suffering. When sudden wealth arrives, it illuminates the shadow with the violence of unexpected light in a room that's been dark for years. Your eyes, your psychological eyes, are not yet adjusted. The brightness hurts, and hurt things strike back. This is why the first impulse upon receiving unexpected abundance is often self-destruction. Not consciously, of course. The ego rationalizes beautifully. I should give most of this away. I don't need much. I should tell everyone so they can share in this joy. I should invest it all immediately in something risky because sitting with it feels wrong. These are not generous impulses. They are the shadow's desperate attempt to return you to the familiar suffering where at least you knew who you were. The shadow asks a question that most people cannot bear to hear. Who are you when you're not the underdog? If your entire identity has been constructed around being the one who endures, who survives against odds, who makes something from nothing, then abundance doesn't feel like a blessing. It feels like death, the death of the persona you've spent decades perfecting, the carefully constructed image of the struggling artist, the noble sufferer, the one who doesn't need material comfort because they're above such things. But Jung knew that every persona is a mask, and beneath that mask is the true self desperately trying to emerge. The struggle persona served a purpose. It protected you when you were genuinely vulnerable, when the world was genuinely hostile to your becoming. But that protection has now become a prison. The guard who once kept you safe has become the jailer who won't let you leave even when the door is open. This is the psychological mechanism behind why so many lottery winners, inheritance receivers, and sudden success stories self-destruct within months. It's not about the money being cursed. It's about the psyche's violent resistance to a reality that contradicts its core programming. If you believe at the deepest level that you are unworthy, that suffering is your birthright, that abundance belongs to other people, then when abundance arrives, your unconscious will systematically dismantle it to restore the familiar equilibrium of lack. The integration work required here is brutal in its honesty. You must sit with the uncomfortable truth that part of you, a part that has been running your life from the shadows, does not want this blessing. That part must be acknowledged, not banished. Jung's method of active imagination becomes essential here. You must dialogue with this resistant part, understand its fear, honor its protective function, and gently, firmly, help it understand that the war is over and it can rest. The archetypal weight. Why chosen ones? Carry the magician's curse. In Jungian psychology, archetypes are primordial patterns of behavior and imagery that exist in the collective unconscious, inherited rather than learned. Every human psyche contains the full spectrum of archetypal energies: the hero, the lover, the sage, the trickster. But chosen ones, those who find themselves repeatedly at the threshold between worlds, tend to embody specific archetypes with unusual intensity. The magician archetype is both blessing and curse for those on the individuation path. The magician understands that reality is more fluid than others perceive, that consciousness can shape matter, that the boundary between inner and outer is permeable. This is the gift, the ability to see synchronicities, to work with energy, to know things before they become manifest in the material world. But the magician's shadow is profound. In its positive aspect, the magician transforms lead into gold, darkness into light, suffering into wisdom. In its shadow aspect, the magician manipulates, deceives, and most dangerously, inflates. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with an archetype rather than serving as its vessel. The conscious I mistakes the power of the self for its own personal power, and this mistake is catastrophic. When sudden wealth arrives for someone carrying strong magician energy, the inflation risk is extreme. The ego whispers, "See, I manifested this. I'm special. I'm chosen because I'm spiritually advanced." This is not confidence, it's psychological poison. Jung watched countless patients destroy themselves through this exact mechanism, mistaking a gift from the self for proof of egoic superiority. The hermit archetype also walks closely with chosen ones, particularly Americans who find themselves alienated from the collective values of consumerism, competition, and superficial success. The hermit withdraws not from weakness, but from wisdom, understanding that solitude is where the deepest truths are discovered. The hermit knows that the crowd's validation is worthless compared to the quiet knowing that comes from authentic self-encounter. But the hermit's shadow manifests as isolation that becomes pathological, withdrawal that becomes avoidance, silence that becomes inability to engage. When abundance arrives for someone strongly identified with the hermit archetype, the temptation is to use the resources to build an even more perfect isolation, a fortress of solitude where transformation can be endlessly delayed under the guise of not being ready yet. The mythological weight of these archetypes explains why chosen ones experience abundance differently than others. For the average person, unexpected money is simply pleasant, a problem solved, a stress relieved. But for someone walking the individuation path, carrying archetypal energies with consciousness, sudden wealth becomes a spiritual crisis. It is Parsifal encountering the Grail, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, Christ in the wilderness. The test is not in the receiving, it's in what happens next. Archangel Michael. The psychological function of spiritual warfare, in Jungian terms. Spiritual figures like Archangel Michael are not external entities, but projections of psychological functions that exist within the psyche itself. Michael represents the discriminating function, the sword of consciousness that cuts through confusion, illusion, and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid the terror of authentic becoming. When abundance arrives unexpectedly and Michael's presence becomes palpable in your awareness, what you are experiencing is your own psyche's attempt to protect the transformation in progress. Michael asks the questions your ego wants to avoid. Will you use this money to finally address your wounds or to sedate them? Will you invest in your becoming Or in maintaining the comfortable persona that's dying anyway? Will you honor the sacrifice of every moment of struggle that brought you here, or betray it through unconscious consumption? This is spiritual warfare, but not against external demons. The battle is entirely internal, between the part of you that wants to evolve and the part that wants to remain safely small. Every spiritual tradition recognizes this dynamic. The Buddhists call it Mara's temptation. The Christians call it Satan's offers in the desert. Jung called it the confrontation with the shadow, and he knew it was the most dangerous passage in the individuation journey. Michael's sword represents psychic surgery, the necessary cutting away of what is dead or dying so that new life can emerge. When you receive sudden abundance and feel Michael's presence, you are being asked to perform this surgery on yourself. What relationships are you maintaining out of guilt rather than genuine connection? What beliefs about money, success, and worthiness are you carrying simply because no one ever questioned them? What aspects of your current life are you funding with energy you no longer have to spare? These questions are violent in their precision. They force you to acknowledge that abundance doesn't solve problems, it reveals them. The person who couldn't pay rent had a convenient excuse for why they weren't pursuing their deepest calling. The person who now has resources has no more excuses, only choices, and choices reveal character with ruthless clarity. The psychological mechanism here is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold tension between opposites until a third thing emerges that transcends both. You are holding the tension between scarcity consciousness, the old familiar identity, and abundance consciousness, the terrifying unknown. Michael's sword prevents you from collapsing prematurely into either extreme, neither returning to poverty through self-sabotage, nor inflating into arrogant consumption. This holding of tension is excruciating. The psyche wants resolution, wants to know definitively who you are now that your external circumstances have shifted so dramatically. But premature resolution aborts the transformation. You must stay in the fire, in the uncertainty, in the space between identities, long enough for the alchemical process to complete. This is why the instruction to tell no one is not about secrecy. It's about protecting the vessel in which this transformation is occurring. The alchemy of sacred silence, why speaking breaks the spell. Alchemy, in Jungian psychology, is not about turning literal lead into literal gold. It is the symbolic language of psychological transformation, the process by which base material, unconscious content, repressed trauma, shadow aspects, is refined through successive stages into gold, integrated consciousness, authentic selfhood, individuation. The alchemical vessel, the container in which this transformation occurs, must be sealed. The old alchemists called this the vas hermeticum, the hermetically sealed flask. If you open the vessel prematurely, if you allow outside air, other people's opinions, projections, energies, to enter the process, the delicate chemical reactions required for transformation are disrupted. What could have become gold remains lead. What could have been integrated remains split. This is the profound psychological truth behind the instruction to tell no one about your sudden abundance. When you speak your blessing aloud, you break the seal. You invite the collective unconscious to flood in through other people's responses. Their envy becomes a psychic intrusion that you must now defend against, diverting energy from the integration work. Their celebration becomes a pressure to perform gratitude before you've genuinely felt it. Their advice becomes noise that drowns out your own inner knowing. But the deeper danger is projection. Human beings cannot help but project their unconscious content onto others, particularly onto those who seem to have what they lack. The moment you announce your financial windfall, You become a screen onto which others project their unlived potential, their resentment, their fantasies about what they would do if they had your opportunity. These projections are not neutral, they carry psychic weight. Jung understood that we are not isolated consciousness units. We exist in a field of collective psychic energy, constantly exchanging unconscious material with everyone we encounter. When someone projects their envy onto you, you don't just intellectually know they're envious. You feel it in your body, in your energy field, as a subtle drain, a heaviness, a contamination of what was previously pure. The chosen ones are particularly vulnerable to this contamination because they are naturally empathic, naturally porous to psychic energies. This porousness is what allowed them to absorb collective shadow material in the first place, but now it becomes a liability. They must learn to seal their field, to protect the sacred transformation occurring within them from well-meaning contamination. Silence creates this seal. When you hold your abundance in sacred privacy, you create a temenos, a sacred space, a psychological sanctuary where the real work can occur. In that silence, with no audience to perform for, no narrative to maintain for external consumption, you meet yourself with brutal honesty. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I actually want? Not what do I think I should want? What fears arise when I'm not defending against others' judgments? These questions can only be answered in solitude. The moment you bring others into the process, their presence, no matter how loving or well-intentioned, shapes your responses. You begin curating your transformation for an audience. And curated transformation is not transformation. It's performance. And performance keeps the persona intact when the persona is precisely what needs to die. The alchemical stages themselves provide the structure for this silent work. Nigredo, the blackening, the descent into darkness, the confrontation with everything you've been avoiding. When abundance arrives, Nigredo manifests as the terror beneath the relief. What if I waste this? What if I don't deserve this? What if this is a mistake that will be taken away? You must sit with these fears in silence, allow them to speak their truth. Understand that they are not obstacles to overcome, but messages from parts of yourself that need attention. Albedo, the whitening, the purification, the washing away of what is not essential. This stage requires brutal honesty about what you've been carrying that isn't yours. The family poverty consciousness, the cultural narrative that spiritual people don't care about money, the identity built around struggle. In silence, you can lay these burdens down without explanation, without justification to others who might not understand. Rubedo, the reddening, the final stage, the birth of the philosophical gold. This is integration, the moment when the transformation becomes irreversible, when the new consciousness is fully embodied. You cannot reach Rubedo by talking about it. You reach it by living it in private until it becomes so fundamental to who you are that it no longer needs external validation. The divine child. Birth through destruction. Jung identified the divine child as one of the most powerful archetypes in the collective unconscious, the symbol of new potential emerging from impossible circumstances, the future being born from the death of the past. Every hero myth contains the divine child motif: Jesus born in a stable, Moses in a basket among reeds, Buddha emerging from his mother's side. The circumstances are always humble, often dangerous, and the child always represents a potential that threatens the existing order. When sudden abundance arrives in your life after prolonged scarcity, you are experiencing the birth of the divine child within your own psyche. This is not metaphorical. A new aspect of yourself, one that can receive, that can hold abundance without guilt, that can exist without the familiar suffering that defined you, is being born. But birth is violent. The body that carries the child must be torn open. What was intact becomes broken. so that new life can emerge. This is why the arrival of abundance feels simultaneously like blessing and crisis. The old you, the one who knew how to survive scarcity, who built an entire identity around making something from nothing, who earned worth through endurance, that person must die. Not symbolically, but psychologically. The neural pathways that fired in response to lack must be pruned. The hormonal patterns that kept you in fight or flight must recalibrate. The very sense of self must dissolve and reorganize around a new center. The pain of this dissolution is profound, and most people will do anything to avoid it. This is why lottery winners so often return to poverty, not because the money runs out, but because the person they would need to become to hold that money feels like death to the person they've been. It's psychologically easier to lose the money and return to the familiar suffering than to endure the excruciating transformation required to become someone new. But you who have read this far, who have stayed present through every word, who have felt the resonance of these truths in your body, you are different. Some part of you has already consented to this death and rebirth. That's why you're experiencing it. The universe doesn't give transformation to those who want it. It gives transformation to those who are ready to be destroyed by it. The divine child archetype also explains the instruction to silence. In every myth, attempts are made to kill the divine child before it reaches maturity. Herod ordering the slaughter of the innocents. Kamsa seeking to destroy Krishna. The forces of the old order always attempt to eliminate the new potential before it can threaten their dominance. Psychologically, this manifests as self-sabotage, as well-meaning others who subtly undermine your transformation, as the collective unconscious itself resisting change. When you announce your blessing prematurely, you expose the divine child to these destructive forces before it's strong enough to survive them. The cynical voice that says, "You'll probably waste it." The friend who needs to borrow money immediately. The family member who reminds you of every past failure. These are not evil people. They are unconscious carriers of the archetypal energy that always attempts to destroy new potential before it becomes irreversible. Silence protects the divine child during its most vulnerable phase. You are not hiding from the world. You are creating the psychological womb space in which this new aspect of yourself can develop without interference. Once it's fully formed, once you have integrated this new consciousness so completely that it cannot be shaken by external opinion, then you can emerge. But not before. The covenant between ego and self. Understanding the transaction in Jungian psychology, the ego is the center of conscious awareness, the I that you experience yourself as being. The self is the totality, the center and circumference of your entire psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. Most people live their entire lives with the ego in the driver's seat, mistaking it for the whole. Individuation is the process by which the ego comes to recognize and serve the self. This is not a merger or fusion. The ego doesn't disappear. It takes its rightful place as the executive function of consciousness, the part that makes daily decisions and navigates the material world, but always in service to the deeper wisdom of the self. This is the covenant. The ego surrenders its illusion of total control, and in return, the self guides the personality toward its deepest fulfillment. Sudden abundance is a moment when this covenant is either established or broken. The self has been orchestrating your entire journey, every struggle, every moment of doubt, every apparent failure that was actually preparation. It has been building your capacity to hold something that your conscious ego couldn't have imagined for itself. Now the self is reaching through material reality to remind the ego, you are not alone in this. Trust the process. But the ego is terrified of surrendering control because control is how it has survived. The ego looks at your history of scarcity and says, "See, I kept you alive through all of that. Don't trust this abundance. It's probably a trick." This is not malicious. It's the ego doing its job, which is to keep you safe according to the only data it has, the past. The self operates from a different knowing. It sees the entire arc of your existence, past and future, and it understands that safety does not come from controlling circumstances, but from alignment with your deepest truth. The self sent this abundance not to make your life easier, though it might, but to force the ego to finally relinquish its death grip on the old story. The covenant is established through trust demonstrated over time. The ego must learn to recognize the self's communications, the synchronicities, the dreams, the quiet inner knowing that speaks beneath the mind's chatter. Every time the ego chooses to trust the self's guidance instead of its own fear-based calculations, the relationship strengthens. Every time the ego demands proof, insists on control, or sabotages the blessings the self is orchestrating, the relationship fractures. This is why the initial response to sudden abundance is so critical. Will the ego immediately seize control, spending, hoarding, or giving away based on old fear patterns? Or will it pause, create space for the self to communicate and ask, "What is this abundance here to teach me? What transformation is being asked of me? How do I need to grow to be a worthy steward of this gift?" The self's answer will come, but not always in words. It comes through the feelings that arise when you contemplate different uses for the money. It comes through dreams that show you what your unconscious truly wants. It comes through the synchronicities that increase or decrease based on your alignment with your deeper path. Learning to read these communications is the essence of psychological and spiritual maturity. Many chosen ones have been operating with a broken covenant, an ego that either refuses to acknowledge the self's existence or is constantly demanding that the self prove itself through miracles. Sudden abundance is the self's ultimate proof. I am real. I have been guiding you all along, and I am far more powerful than your conscious mind can comprehend. Will you finally trust me? Integration. The terror of becoming who you actually are, integration, is the word Jungian psychology uses for the process of bringing unconscious contents into conscious awareness and assimilating them into the personality. It sounds technical, almost clinical, but the lived experience of integration is violence, terror, and the complete dissolution of everything you thought you knew about yourself. When abundance arrives suddenly, it forces integration of every aspect of yourself you've been disowning. The part that wants luxury, the part that craves recognition, the part that is tired of being humble and wants to be seen as powerful. These shadow aspects have been living in exile because you believed they were shameful, selfish, or incompatible with being a good person. But Jung understood that wholeness requires the integration of everything, not just the socially acceptable parts, but the hungry, ambitious, pleasure-seeking, status-conscious parts too. Not to act out these impulses unconsciously, but to acknowledge their existence, understand their function, and find conscious ways to honor them that don't harm yourself or others. The terror comes from the realization that you are not who you thought.